Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Arkansas Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the late summer of 1892, in the remote hills of northwestern Arkansas, 3 sisters and their elderly father vanished under circumstances that would perplex investigators for more than a century. What remained was a small family chapel, a handful of contradictory witness testimonies, and a discovery beneath that chapel's stone foundation that challenged every rational explanation offered by medical and legal authorities of the period. The Whitmore family had established themselves in Madison County, Arkansas, in the spring of 1871, shortly after the conclusion of the Civil War had driven many families westward in search of new beginnings. According to property records filed with the Madison County Courthouse in Huntsville, Cornelius Whitmore purchased 240 acres of heavily forested land approximately 18 miles northeast of the county seat, in a hollow that local settlers referred to as Crow's Basin. The land deed, dated April 12, 1871, describes the property as bordered to the north by Withrow Creek, to the east by limestone bluffs rising nearly 300 feet above the valley floor, and to the south and west by dense stands of white oak and hickory that had remained largely untouched since before European settlement. The nearest neighbor, a subsistence farmer named Josiah Blackwell, lived approximately 4 miles to the southwest along a barely passable wagon trail that became impassable during the winter months and spring flooding. Cornelius Whitmore arrived in Madison County with credentials that distinguished him from the typical frontier settler of the period. Born in 1825 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to a family of Moravian heritage, Cornelius had received formal education at a theological seminary in Bethlehem before abandoning his ministerial studies in 1848 to pursue what he described in personal correspondence as investigations into ancient languages and comparative religious texts. Tax records from Berks County, Pennsylvania, indicate that Cornelius worked as a schoolmaster and private tutor throughout the 1850s, accumulating a considerable personal library that neighbors later recalled required 3 full wagons to transport when the family departed Pennsylvania in 1870. The reasons for this departure remain unclear, though a brief notice in the Reading Eagle, dated September 3, 1870, mentions that Cornelius Whitmore had resigned his teaching position following unspecified disagreements with the school board regarding curriculum content and educational philosophy. Cornelius arrived in Arkansas accompanied by his 3 daughters born from his marriage to Catherine Brenner, who had died of consumption in 1869, according to death records filed in Berks County. The eldest daughter, Adelaide, was 22 years old in 1871, described in a letter written by a Pennsylvania neighbor as possessing remarkable intelligence and having served as her father's assistant in his tutorial work. The middle daughter, Beatrice, aged 19, had demonstrated musical talents and had studied piano and voice with instructors in Reading. The youngest, Constance, just 16 years old when the family relocated, was noted in the same neighbor's correspondence as being of a nervous and delicate constitution, prone to episodes of melancholy that had worsened following her mother's death. No records indicate that any of the daughters had married, which was unusual for women of their ages and social standing in the 1870s. and several letters preserved in the Madison County Historical Society archives suggest that Cornelius had rejected multiple suitors for his daughters, insisting they remain in the family home to assist with his scholarly pursuits. The Whitmore property in Crow's Basin occupied a particularly isolated position even by the standards of the Arkansas Ozarks in the 1870s. The hollow took its name from the massive flocks of crows that roosted in the surrounding forests, their calls echoing off the limestone bluffs in a cacophony that settlers found deeply unsettling. The land itself consisted of a narrow valley, perhaps half a mile wide, through which Withrow Creek meandered in a series of sharp bends before disappearing underground into a cave system that local Cherokee had warned early settlers to avoid. According to oral histories collected by the Madison County Historical Society in the 1930s, the Cherokee had names for certain locations in the region that translated roughly as places where the earth speaks or where the old things sleep, and Crow's Basin appeared to be among these marked locations. White settlers who had attempted to establish farms in the hollow prior to the Whitmore's arrival had universally abandoned their claims within 2 or 3 years, citing crop failures, livestock deaths, and a general atmosphere of unease that made extended habitation unbearable. Cornelius Whitmore appeared undeterred by these warnings or by the hollow's reputation. Within the first year of acquiring the property, he and his daughters constructed a substantial 2-story house of hewn oak logs positioned on a rise overlooking Withrow Creek. More unusually, they also built a small chapel approximately 200 yards from the main house, situated at the base of the eastern limestone bluffs. This chapel, measuring roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, was constructed not of wood, but of limestone blocks quarried from the bluffs themselves, a labor-intensive undertaking that must have required months of work. The structure featured a steep, pitched roof covered in split oak shingles, narrow lancet windows of plain glass on the north and south walls, and a heavy oak door reinforced with iron straps. According to the testimony of Josiah Blackwell, given to Madison County Sheriff Thomas Culpepper in October 1892, Cornelius Whitmore had hired Blackwell and his 2 grown sons to assist with transporting the limestone blocks from the quarry site to the chapel foundation, work that took place during the summer of 1872. Blackwell recalled that Cornelius had been very particular about the chapel's positioning, insisting that it be built directly over what appeared to be a natural depression or sink in the earth, and that the foundation extend down into this depression to a depth of at least 8 feet. What makes the chapel's construction particularly significant is that the Whitmore family did not affiliate with any established church in Madison County, nor did they invite neighbors or local clergy to hold services in the building. The Reverend Samuel Hodges, pastor of the Huntsville Methodist Church, noted in his diary entry dated May 15, 1873, that he had traveled to the Whitmore property to welcome the family and offer his pastoral services, only to be politely but firmly dismissed by Cornelius, who stated that the family observed their own forms of worship and required no external guidance. Reverend Hodges wrote that he found this response troubling, and that during his brief visit he had observed through the chapel's open door what appeared to be an altar of unusual design, not featuring a Christian cross, but rather a flat stone surface inscribed with symbols he did not recognize. The Reverend noted that the 3 daughters had watched him from the windows of the main house throughout his visit, but had not emerged or spoken, and that their pale, unsmiling faces had given him a distinct impression of captivity rather than familial devotion. For nearly 2 decades following their arrival in Crow's Basin, the Whitmore family maintained a pattern of extreme isolation, punctuated by occasional necessary interactions with the outside world. Cornelius made infrequent trips to Huntsville to purchase supplies, typically appearing 4 or 5 times per year to buy flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, and other essentials that could not be produced on the property. Store ledgers preserved at the Madison County Historical Society show that Cornelius also made regular purchases of books, which he special ordered through a merchant named Abel Morton, who maintained connections with booksellers in St. Louis and Chicago. These book orders, recorded in Morton's account books from 1873 through 1891, reveal a pattern of increasingly esoteric interests. Early purchases included standard theological works and Greek and Latin grammars, but by the 1880s, Cornelius was ordering texts on comparative mythology, archaeological reports from expeditions to the Middle East, and treatises on ancient mystery religions that Morton noted he had considerable difficulty obtaining. In a letter to a St. Louis book dealer dated March 1887, Morton wrote that his customer in the hills had requested works of such obscure and specialized nature that he questioned whether they should be made available to a layman, particularly one living in such isolation from scholarly or ecclesiastical oversight. The 3 Whitmore daughters were rarely seen in Huntsville during these years, though they occasionally accompanied their father on his supply runs. Those who encountered them invariably remarked upon their unusual appearance and demeanor. A notice in the Huntsville Herald, dated August the 20th, 1881, mentioned that the Mrs. Whitmore had caused quite a stir by appearing in town dressed in old-fashioned garments that seemed more appropriate to the 1840s than the 1880s, with high-necked dresses of dark fabric, their hair severely pulled back and covered with caps or bonnets that obscured much of their faces. The newspaper account, written in the mildly humorous tone typical of rural journalism of the period, noted that the young women had spoken to no one, had kept their eyes downcast, and had remained close to their father at all times, giving the impression of novices from a Catholic order rather than daughters of a Protestant family. More troubling were observations recorded in the private diary of Dr. Edwin Marsh, the only physician serving Madison County during the 1880s. In an entry dated November 7, 1883, Dr. Marsh wrote that he had encountered Cornelius Whitmore and his daughters in Huntsville, and that he had been struck by the extreme pallor of the young women, their apparent malnourishment, and what he described as a peculiar quality of their eyes, which seemed both vacant and intensely focused, as though they were seeing things invisible to others. Dr. Marsh noted that he had offered his medical services should the family require them, but Cornelius had dismissed the offer with the statement that his daughters enjoyed perfect health and that the family had no need of conventional medicine. The first indication of something seriously wrong at the Whitmore property emerged in the spring of 1889, when a traveling preacher named Elijah Cobb attempted to reach the family as part of a circuit-riding ministry through the remote areas of Madison County. Reverend Cobb, a Baptist minister from Missouri, later testified before a coroner's inquest that he had arrived at the Whitmore house on the morning of April 3, 1889, hoping to offer spiritual counsel and perhaps distribute some religious tracts. He stated that he had knocked on the door of the main house repeatedly without receiving any response, though he could clearly hear movement inside and could see lamplight through the shuttered windows despite the late morning hour. Growing concerned, Reverend Cobb had walked to the chapel and found its door standing open. What he witnessed inside caused him to immediately abandon his missionary efforts and return to Huntsville to report his observations to Sheriff Culpeper. According to Reverend Cobb's statement, given under oath on April 5, 1889, the chapel's interior had been transformed into something that bore no resemblance to any Christian place of worship. The walls were covered with what appeared to be chalk drawings or paintings depicting human figures in various stages of contortion and transformation, some appearing to be halfway between human and animal forms. The altar he had heard about from Reverend Hodges was still present, but its surface was now stained dark brown in a way that Cobb believed indicated repeated applications of blood. More disturbing still were the objects arranged around the altar, fragments of bone that might have been animal or might have been something else, clay vessels filled with substances that gave off a putrid odor, and several large leather-bound books lying open to pages covered in handwritten text in languages Cobb did not recognize. Sheriff Culpeper, accompanied by Deputy James Whitaker and Reverend Cobb, rode out to the Whitmore property on April 6, 1889, to investigate these claims. The sheriff's official report, filed with the Madison County Court, describes their arrival at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They found Cornelius Whitmore, then 64 years old, seated on the porch of the main house, apparently engaged in reading. When Sheriff Culpeper explained the reason for their visit and asked permission to inspect the chapel, Cornelius initially refused, stating that the building was private property, dedicated to his family's personal spiritual practices, and that neither the law nor any religious authority had jurisdiction over its interior. Only when Sheriff Culpeper suggested that refusal to cooperate might necessitate obtaining a warrant and returning with additional deputies did Cornelius relent. The sheriff's report describes entering the chapel and confirming many of Reverend Cobb's observations. The walls were indeed covered with disturbing imagery, though Cornelius explained these as reproductions of ancient religious art from various cultures, created by his daughters as part of their education in comparative religion. The stains on the altar, he claimed, were from animal sacrifices performed as historical reenactments of Old Testament practices intended to help the family better understand the religious mindset of ancient peoples. The bones were identified by Cornelius as remains from these same animal sacrifices, and the books were scholarly texts in Greek, Latin, and Aramaic that dealt with ancient mystery religions. Sheriff Culpeper wrote in his report that while these explanations were unusual and certainly unconventional, they did not necessarily indicate any violation of law. The sheriff noted that he had requested to speak with the three daughters and that after a lengthy delay they had emerged from the main house. His description of the encounter is revealing. He wrote that the three women appeared to be in their late 30s or early 40s, though he knew their actual ages to be 39, 37, and 34, respectively. They were thin to the point of emaciation, their skin had a grayish pallor, and their hair, visible beneath their bonnets, showed extensive premature graying. More unsettling was their behavior. They stood in a row before the sheriff and deputy, perfectly still, their hands clasped at their waists, their eyes fixed on the ground. When Sheriff Culpeper asked them questions about their well-being and whether they were being held against their will, they responded in unison, their voices flat and emotionless, stating that they were content, that they served their Father willingly, and that outsiders could not understand the important work being conducted on the property. Deputy Whitaker noted in his supplementary report that this unison speech seemed rehearsed, and that at one point when Adelaide, the eldest, appeared about to speak independently, Cornelius had made a small gesture with his hand, and she had immediately fallen silent. Despite these concerning observations, Sheriff Culpeper concluded that he had no legal grounds to take action. The daughters were adults. They claimed to be acting of their own free will, and while their lifestyle was certainly peculiar, it did not constitute a crime. The sheriff did warn Cornelius that animal sacrifice, even for educational purposes, must be conducted in a sanitary manner that did not pose a public health risk, and that any evidence of human sacrifice or other serious crimes would result in immediate arrest. Cornelius assured the sheriff that his warnings were understood and unnecessary, and the matter was, at least officially, closed. However, the incident had aroused considerable interest and concern in Huntsville. The Huntsville Herald published a lengthy article on April 13, 1889, titled "Peculiar Practices in Crow's Basin," which recounted the sheriff's investigation and speculated about the true nature of the Whitmore family's activities. The article noted that while Cornelius Whitmore claimed to be engaged in scholarly research, his isolation and the strange behavior of his daughters suggested something far more sinister might be occurring. The newspaper called upon county authorities to maintain vigilant oversight of the property and to investigate further if any additional evidence of wrongdoing emerged. This additional evidence began to emerge in the form of nighttime disturbances reported by the few settlers living within several miles of Crow's Basin. Josiah Blackwell, whose farm was the closest to the Whitmore property, told several people in Huntsville during the summer of 1889 that he had been hearing strange sounds coming from the direction of the Whitmore chapel on certain nights, particularly during the dark of the moon. He described these sounds as a combination of chanting in unfamiliar languages, rhythmic drumming or beating, and occasionally screams that seemed to echo off the limestone bluffs with an unnatural resonance. Blackwell stated that he had approached to within about a mile of the property on one such night in July 1889 and had seen lights moving in the area around the chapel, not the steady glow of lamps, but flickering, dancing lights that seemed to move independently of any visible person carrying them. More troubling, he reported finding the carcasses of several of his sheep in a pasture that bordered the Whitmore property, the animals apparently killed not by predators, but by what appeared to be systematic exsanguination, their throats cut with precision and their blood drained so thoroughly that the carcasses seemed desiccated. Blackwell reported these incidents to Sheriff Culpeper, but without direct evidence linking the Whitmore family to the sheep killings, no charges could be filed. Other witnesses came forward with similar accounts. A young couple, Nathan and Elizabeth Porter, who had established a small farm about 6 miles south of Crow's Basin, reported to Dr. Marsh that they had seen one of the Whitmore daughters. They believed it to be Constance, the youngest, walking alone through the forest at twilight in September 1889. This alone would have been noteworthy, as the daughters were rarely seen away from their father's direct supervision. But what made the encounter truly disturbing was the young woman's appearance and behavior. Elizabeth Porter stated that Constance had been walking barefoot despite the rocky terrain, wearing only a thin white shift that was stained with what appeared to be mud or something darker. Her hair was unbound and hung in wild tangles to her waist. When the Porters had called out to her, asking if she needed assistance, Constance had turned to look at them, and Elizabeth insisted that the young woman's eyes had reflected the dying light like an animal's eyes, showing a greenish gleam that lasted several seconds. Constance had then spoken in a voice that Elizabeth described as not quite human, the words unclear, but the tone suggesting a language far older than English. Before the porters could approach closer, Constance had turned and run into the forest with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for someone of her apparent frail health, disappearing among the trees like a deer. Dr. Marsh, increasingly concerned about these reports, decided to make an unofficial visit to the Whitmore property in October 1889, ostensibly to offer his medical services, but actually to observe the family and assess whether intervention might be necessary. His diary entry from October 18, 1889, provides a detailed account of this visit. He arrived at the property in mid-morning and found Cornelius working in a garden plot near the main house. The old man received him cordially enough, though with obvious reluctance, and when Dr. Marsh again offered to examine the daughters, Cornelius stated flatly that his daughters saw no visitors and that their health was his responsibility alone. Dr. Marsh noted that during this conversation he had observed one of the daughters watching from an upstairs window of the house, her face pressed close to the glass. Even from a distance of perhaps 50 yards, the doctor wrote that he could see signs of extreme distress in the young woman's features, a wild desperation in her expression that suggested either severe mental instability or a desperate desire to communicate something she could not speak aloud. When Dr. Marsh had raised his hand in a gesture of greeting, the face had immediately vanished from the window, and moments later he had heard what sounded like a sharp slap and a muffled cry from inside the house. Dr. Marsh's growing alarm led him to speak with several other community members about organizing some form of intervention, possibly requesting that the county authorities conduct a more thorough investigation of the Whitmore property. However, these efforts were frustrated by the legal and social realities of the period. The daughters were adult women who had stated, at least publicly, that they remained with their father voluntarily. Cornelius had committed no provable crime. The Constitution protected religious freedom, even for unorthodox practices, and without clear evidence of immediate harm, authorities were hesitant to violate property rights or family privacy. Additionally, the remote location of the Whitmore property and the difficulty of maintaining any kind of surveillance over it made ongoing monitoring effectively impossible. The matter might have continued indefinitely in this state of concerned suspicion without resolution, had it not been for the events that began to unfold in the summer of 1892. The first of these events occurred on June 21st, 1892, the summer solstice, though this timing was not immediately recognized as significant. A young boy named Thomas Murphy, age 12, who lived with his parents on a farm about 7 miles west of Crow's Basin, became lost while hunting squirrels in the forest. After wandering for several hours, Thomas found himself at the edge of a clearing he did not recognize, and from his position concealed among the trees, he could see the Whitmore Chapel, perhaps 200 yards away. The time was late afternoon, and Thomas later stated that he had been about to call out for help when something about the scene before him made him remain hidden and silent. The chapel door was open, and he could see figures moving inside. After several minutes, 4 figures emerged. An old man he assumed was Cornelius Whitmore, and 3 women. But it was the appearance and behavior of these women that Thomas found so disturbing that he remained hidden, watching in horrified fascination. Thomas Murphy's testimony, given to his parents and later to Sheriff Culpeper, described the 3 women as moving in a synchronized manner that seemed choreographed, walking in the single file from the chapel to a point perhaps 30 feet from the building where the ground appeared to show a depression or opening. Each woman carried a clay vessel or bowl, and as Thomas watched, they stopped at this depression and appeared to pour the contents of their vessels into it. Even from his distance, Thomas stated that he could see the liquid they poured was dark red, and that as it splashed into the depression, it seemed to produce a faint mist or steam, though the day was warm, and such a reaction made no sense. More disturbing was what happened next. The three women set down their empty vessels and began to remove their clothing. Thomas, only 12 years old and raised in a devout Christian household, stated that he had immediately looked away, embarrassed and confused, but the sounds he heard made him look back despite his better judgment. The women were not simply undressing, but seemed to be performing some kind of ritual dance around the depression, their movements becoming increasingly frenzied and their voices rising in a chant that Thomas could hear clearly despite the distance. He stated that the language was like nothing he had ever heard. Not English, not the German or Irish phrases he had heard from immigrant families, but something that hurt his ears and made his stomach feel sick. The old man, Cornelius, stood watching this display with his arms raised, and he seemed to be calling out responses to the women's chanting. Young Thomas had seen enough. Despite his lost condition, he fled through the forest, running blindly until exhaustion forced him to stop. By providence or chance, he stumbled onto a logging road he recognized and made his way home well after dark, arriving at his parents' farm in a state of severe distress. His father, John Murphy, initially dismissed the story as the imagined fears of a lost child. But Thomas's detailed and consistent account, along with the boy's genuine terror, convinced John that something serious had occurred. The following morning, June 22nd, John Murphy rode to Huntsville and reported his son's experience to Sheriff Culpeper. The sheriff, already concerned about the Whitmore family based on previous incidents, decided that this new testimony justified another investigation. On June 24th, Sheriff Culpeper, Deputy Whitaker, and Dr. Marsh, whom the sheriff invited to provide medical assessment if needed, rode out to the Whitmore property for what would prove to be their final official visit before the family's disappearance. The sheriff's report from this visit, filed on June 25, 1892, describes a disturbing scene. They arrived at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning and found the property eerily quiet. No one responded to their calls, neither from the main house nor from the chapel. After waiting for perhaps half an hour and receiving no response, Sheriff Culpeper determined that the circumstances justified entering the buildings to ensure no one was injured or in distress. The main house, when they entered it, showed signs of habitation, but was in a state of disarray that suggested hasty abandonment or violent struggle. Furniture was overturned, books and papers were scattered across the floors, dishes were broken, and in the kitchen they found food left out that had begun to spoil, suggesting no one had been present for at least several days. More troubling were the marks they found on the walls of one upstairs bedroom, which appeared to be fingernail scratches gouged deeply into the wooden walls, some deep enough to have drawn blood that left dark stains on the wood. Dr. Marsh noted in his supplementary report that these scratches covered an area approximately 6 feet wide and stretched from about 3 feet above the floor to over 7 feet high, suggesting someone had been scrabbling at the walls while standing and then perhaps while being lifted or suspended in some manner. The chapel, when they entered it, presented an even more disturbing scene. The interior had been transformed since their last visit in 1889. The walls were now completely covered in writing, not paintings or drawings, but dense text written in multiple languages and scripts, some of which Dr. Marsh recognized as Greek and Latin. others completely unfamiliar. The altar was surrounded by dozens of clay vessels, some empty, others containing dried residue that Sheriff Culpepper believed to be blood of either animal or human origin. Most disturbing was the floor of the chapel. The wooden floorboards in the center of the structure had been torn up and cast aside, revealing the stone foundation beneath, and this stone had been broken through to expose what appeared to be a shaft or opening descending into darkness below the chapel. Sheriff Culpepper noted that a rope had been tied to one of the heavy stone blocks that formed the chapel's walls, and this rope extended down into the opening. A foul odor rose from this shaft, a combination of decay, damp earth, and something else that the sheriff described as unlike anything he had previously encountered, a smell that seemed to bypass the nose and trigger revulsion directly in the stomach and mind. After a brief discussion, it was decided that someone should descend into the opening to investigate. Deputy Whitaker, the youngest and most physically capable of the three men, volunteered for this duty. Using the rope already in place and with a lantern lowered before him, Whitaker descended into the darkness beneath the chapel while Sheriff Culpepper and Dr. Marsh waited above. The deputy's report, written the same day while memories were fresh, describes descending approximately 20 feet through a narrow shaft that appeared to be partially natural cave formation and partially excavated by human hands. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a larger chamber, a cave room perhaps 15 feet across. The walls of this chamber were covered in the same strange writing seen in the chapel above, but here it had been carved into the limestone with considerable effort. The letters gouged deep into the rock. In the center of the chamber was a circular depression in the floor, approximately 4 feet in diameter, that appeared to have been artificially deepened and smoothed. This depression was filled with a dark liquid that Whitaker initially took to be water, but which, when he lowered his lantern closer, proved to be something thicker and darker, a substance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Around this central pool were arranged 13 clay vessels, similar to those found in the chapel above, and in these vessels were objects that Whitaker described as organic in nature, but impossible to identify with certainty. Things that might have been preserved organs or plants unlike any he recognized, or perhaps something between the two. Most significantly, Whitaker found no sign of the Whitmore family in the underground chamber. However, he did find evidence of very recent occupation. The floor showed footprints in the damp limestone dust, some barefoot and small enough to be women's feet, others larger and shod. There were also marks suggesting something had been dragged across the floor toward the dark pool in the chamber's center. Whitaker stated that as he examined these marks, he became overwhelmed by a feeling of being watched, and that the smell from the pool intensified to the point where he felt physically ill. More disturbing, he reported hearing sounds that seemed to come from beyond the chamber, from deeper in the cave system that the underground room connected to. These sounds were rhythmic and wet, like something very large breathing, though he could see no passages large enough to admit anything of significant size. Seized by a sudden and overwhelming panic, Whitaker climbed back up the rope as quickly as possible, emerging into the chapel in a state that Sheriff Culpepper described as near hysteria. After Deputy Whitaker had recovered somewhat, the three men conducted a search of the surrounding property, calling out for the Whitmore family and looking for any indication of where they might have gone. They found nothing. The family's horses were still in the barn, eliminating the possibility that they had ridden away. No wagon tracks led away from the property. Their clothing, at least most of it, remained in the house. It was as though 4 people had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind all their possessions and disappearing without trace. Sheriff Culpeper ordered the property secured and returned to Huntsville to organize a more extensive search. Over the following week, groups of men from Huntsville and surrounding farms searched Crow's Basin and the surrounding forests for any sign of the missing family. They found nothing. The limestone bluffs were examined for any indication that the family might have fallen or been pushed to their deaths, but no remains were discovered. The cave system that connected to the chamber beneath the chapel was explored as far as men dared to venture, but the passages became increasingly narrow and treacherous, and the searchers were plagued by that same feeling of oppressive dread that Deputy Whitaker had reported, a sense of presence and malevolent attention that made extended exploration unbearable. The official investigation, hampered by lack of evidence and by the sheer inexplicability of the disappearance, eventually concluded that the Whitmore family had likely fled the property voluntarily, possibly fearing prosecution for the unorthodox and possibly illegal religious practices they had been conducting. This explanation satisfied no one, least of all those who had witnessed the condition of the property and the evidence of the family's activities. How could 4 people, including a man nearly 70 years old, vanish completely from an isolated property without using horses or wagon, without taking any provisions, without leaving any trail? Why would they flee when no charges had yet been filed against them? And most troubling, what had they been doing in that underground chamber? And what was the nature of the dark liquid in the central pool? Dr. Edwin Marsh, whose medical and scientific training made him unwilling to accept supernatural explanations, requested permission to take samples from the underground chamber for analysis. In early July 1890, he returned to the Whitmore property, accompanied by a colleague, Dr. Robert Finch, who had training in chemistry and who maintained a small laboratory in Fayetteville. The 2 doctors descended into the chamber beneath the chapel and collected samples of the dark liquid from the central pool, as well as specimens from the clay vessels and scrapings from the carved walls. Dr. Marsh's journal entry from July 8, 1892, describes his reactions during this collection process. He wrote that the liquid from the pool had a consistency unlike water, more viscous and almost oily, and that it was unnaturally cold despite the summer heat and the depth of the chamber. More disturbing, he noted that when he placed his hand near the surface of the liquid without touching it, he experienced a tingling sensation and a feeling of vertiginous disorientation, as though the liquid exerted some influence beyond mere physical substance. Dr. Finch reported similar sensations and additionally noted that his instruments behaved strangely near the pool, with his thermometer giving wildly fluctuating readings and his compass spinning without settling on any direction. The analysis of these samples, conducted over the course of several weeks, yielded results that Dr. Marsh described as bewildering and impossible to reconcile with conventional scientific understanding. The dark liquid contained organic compounds that Dr. Finch could not identify, substances that seemed to be neither animal nor plant in origin, but something entirely outside existing taxonomies. Chemical tests that should have produced predictable results instead yielded contradictory outcomes, with the samples sometimes behaving as acids, sometimes as bases, sometimes as neither. Most disturbing were Dr. Finch's observations regarding the samples' behavior over time. He noted that the liquid samples seemed to remain viable long after they should have degraded, that they appeared to react to the presence of living tissue in ways that suggested a form of animate response, and that when he attempted to examine them under a microscope, the samples seemed to avoid the light, moving in ways that could not be explained by normal fluid dynamics. Dr. Finch concluded his report, a copy of which is preserved in the archives of the University of Arkansas, with the statement that he could not in good conscience provide a scientific explanation for the sample's properties, and that he recommended the remaining material be disposed of and the site beneath the chapel be sealed permanently. This recommendation was never implemented, largely because public interest in the case began to wane as months passed without any new developments. The Whitmore property remained abandoned, and in 1893 it was seized by Madison County for unpaid taxes. Several attempts were made to sell the land, but no buyers could be found, partly due to the property's remote location, but primarily because of its growing reputation as a place of evil. Local residents began referring to Crow's Basin as the hollow that swallowed the Whitmores, and parents warned children to stay away from the area. Hunters and travelers who passed through the region reported continuing disturbances, strange lights around the chapel at night, sounds of chanting or screaming echoing from the limestone bluffs, and a persistent sense of being watched by unseen presences. Several people claimed to have seen figures moving near the chapel in the years following the disappearances, figures that might have been the Whitmore sisters, though these sightings were always distant, always ambiguous, and never confirmed. The case took a new and disturbing turn in 1909, 17 years after the Whitmore family's disappearance, when a young woman appeared in Huntsville claiming to be Constance Whitmore, the youngest of the three sisters. This woman, who appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s, rather than the 51 years old that Constance would have been in 1909, approached Sheriff Walter Hayes, who had succeeded Thomas Culpeper after his death in 1904, and requested to make a statement about the events of 1892. Sheriff Hayes, intrigued but skeptical, agreed to hear her account, which he recorded in a statement dated October 14, 1909, now held in the Madison County Archives. The woman who claimed to be Constance stated that she and her sisters had not been willing participants in their father's practices, but rather had been held as virtual prisoners, subjected to years of psychological manipulation, physical abuse, and forced participation in rituals whose true purpose they had not understood. She stated that Cornelius Whitmore had become convinced through his study of ancient texts that it was possible to achieve a form of immortality or transcendence through specific practices conducted at locations where what he called the membrane between worlds was thin. Crow's Basin, with its cave system and its history of being regarded as sacred or forbidden by indigenous peoples, had attracted him precisely because he believed it to be such a location. According to this woman's account, the rituals conducted in the chapel and in the chamber beneath it had escalated throughout the 1880s and early 1890s, beginning with animal sacrifice, but progressing to other practices that she refused to detail, stating only that they involved blood, ancient languages whose words seemed to have effects beyond mere communication, and attempts to contact or summon entities from what her father called the spaces between. She claimed that all three sisters had sought to escape, but had been prevented by their father's psychological dominance, and by their growing fear that they had already progressed too far in the rituals to return to normal life. She stated that on June 21, 1892, during what was meant to be the culminating ritual, something had gone terribly wrong. The entity or force that her father had been attempting to summon or contact had indeed responded, but not in the way Cornelius had expected. The woman became increasingly agitated as she described this event, speaking of darkness that moved with intention, of voices that spoke directly into the mind without using sound, of her father being taken down into the pool in the underground chamber while her sisters watched in paralyzed horror. She claimed that she alone had managed to flee, escaping from the chapel while the attention of whatever had emerged was focused on her father and sisters, and that she had lived in hiding for 17 years before finally finding the courage to come forward. Sheriff Hayes was uncertain how to respond to this testimony. The woman knew details about the Whitmore property and the family's history that seemed to support her identity claim, but her appearance and her story were both so implausible that he hesitated to accept them at face value. He requested that Dr. Marsh, still practicing in Madison County, examine the woman and provide his assessment. Dr. Marsh's report from this examination, written on October 16, 1909, expresses his complete bafflement. The woman appeared to be approximately 30 years old, based on her physical development and the condition of her skin and hair, yet if she truly was Constance Whitmore, she should have been more than 50. She bore no identification and could provide no verifiable account of her whereabouts during the 17 years since the disappearance. Most troubling, Dr. Marsh noted several physical anomalies. The woman's eyes showed an unusual reflective quality when light struck them at certain angles, similar to the tapetum lucidum found in nocturnal animals, but never in humans. Her body temperature was several degrees below normal, yet she showed no signs of hypothermia or distress. When Dr. Marsh attempted to draw blood for testing, the woman became extremely agitated and refused, eventually fleeing from his office before the examination could be completed. She was never seen in Huntsville again, and her true identity remains unknown. This incident renewed interest in the Whitmore case, and in the summer of 1910, a group of researchers from the University of Arkansas, led by Professor Martin Ashfield of the Department of Anthropology, received permission from Madison County authorities to conduct a formal investigation of the Whitmore property. Professor Ashfield's expedition report, published in the Journal of American Folklore in 1911, provides the most detailed scholarly examination of the site. The expedition spent 3 weeks at Crow's Basin, documenting the chapel, excavating around its foundation, exploring the underground chamber, and interviewing local residents about their knowledge of the property and the events of 1892. Professor Ashfield approached the investigation with appropriate academic skepticism, seeking rational explanations for the strange phenomena reported at the site. His report acknowledges that the Whitmore family clearly engaged in some form of unorthodox religious practice, possibly influenced by Cornelius's studies of ancient mystery religions and Gnostic traditions. The writings on the chapel walls and in the underground chamber included fragments of Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Coptic, often combined in ways that suggested either genuine ancient texts or contemporary constructions attempting to imitate such texts. The chamber beneath the chapel was confirmed to connect to an extensive natural cave system, and Professor Ashfield suggested that unusual acoustic properties of these caves might explain the strange sounds reported by witnesses, while natural variations in air pressure and gas composition could account for the feelings of unease and disorientation that seemed to affect everyone who entered the space. However, Professor Ashfield's report also contains admissions that certain aspects of the site defied his rational framework. The dark liquid that had been observed in the central pool in 1892 was no longer present, and the pool itself appeared to have been scoured clean, though by what agency and for what purpose remained unknown. The expedition did find residues on the walls of the underground chamber that, when analyzed, contained biological material from multiple sources, some identified as human, some as various animals common to the region, and some that could not be conclusively identified. More significantly, the expedition experienced several incidents that Professor Ashfield struggled to explain. 3 separate members of the expedition reported seeing figures in the forest surrounding the property, figures that appeared to be women in light-colored garments who were observed briefly before disappearing among the trees. These sightings occurred on different days and to individuals who were not together at the time, making collective hallucination unlikely. Additionally, the expedition's photographic equipment malfunctioned repeatedly when attempts were made to photograph the underground chamber, with plates either failing to develop or developing, with strange distortions and shadow shapes that did not correspond to anything visible in the chamber when the photographs were taken. Most disturbingly, 2 members of the expedition, a graduate student named Harold Pierce and a local guide named Samuel Yates, had to be removed from the site after they both reported experiencing vivid and disturbing dreams that seemed to draw them toward the underground chamber. Both men described dreams in which they heard voices calling them to descend into the pool, promises of knowledge and transformation if they would only submerge themselves in the darkness below. Professor Ashfield noted that these men showed signs of genuine psychological distress and that he had no choice but to send them back to Fayetteville for medical evaluation, where both eventually recovered after several weeks of rest and distance from Crow's Basin. Professor Ashfield's final conclusion, while carefully worded to maintain academic respectability, acknowledged that something genuinely anomalous existed at the Whitmore site. He suggested that the combination of natural cave features, including possible gas emissions and unusual mineral compositions, along with the psychological effects of isolation and the family's intense religious practices, had created an environment where reality itself seemed to become unstable. He stopped short of endorsing supernatural explanations, but admitted that science in 1910 lacked the tools to fully understand what had occurred in Crow's Basin. His report concluded with a recommendation that the chapel be dismantled, the underground chamber be sealed with concrete, and the property be permanently restricted from settlement or development. This recommendation was partially implemented in 1912, when Madison County, concerned about liability should anyone be injured exploring the site, arranged for the chapel to be demolished and for the opening to the underground chamber to be filled with rubble and capped with a heavy iron grate secured with chains. For several decades following these actions, the Whitmore property remained largely forgotten, mentioned only occasionally in local histories and folklore collections as an example of the isolated religious extremism that could develop on the frontier. However, the site never entirely lost its reputation for strangeness. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, hunters and hikers continued to report unusual experiences in Crow's Basin. Sensations of being followed, sounds of movement in the forest that never resolved into visible sources, and that persistent, oppressive atmosphere of dread that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. In 1934, a group of teenagers from Huntsville, emboldened by Prohibition-era moonshine, broke through the iron grate covering the opening beneath where the chapel had stood and descended into the underground chamber. Two of these young men, Robert Klein and Joseph Ferris, became separated from their companions in the cave system beyond the chamber. A search party found them 3 days later, wandering in the forest several miles from Crow's Basin, both suffering from severe dehydration, exposure, and what was initially diagnosed as shock. Neither young man could or would explain what had happened to them in the caves. Robert Klein never recovered psychologically from the experience, spending the remainder of his life in the Arkansas State Hospital in Little Rock, while Joseph Ferris left Arkansas shortly after his recovery, and, according to family members, never spoke of the incident again before his death in 1969. The most recent significant investigation of the Whitmore site occurred in 1908 when Dr. Catherine Reynolds, a professor of folklore and religious studies at the University of Missouri, led a research team to Crow's Basin as part of a project documenting unusual religious movements in the Ozark region. Dr. Reynolds' work, published in her book Liminal Spaces, Religion and Resistance in the Arkansas Ozarks, devotes an entire chapter to the Whitmore case. She brought to the site modern archaeological techniques, including ground-penetrating radar, which revealed that the cave system beneath the former chapel location was far more extensive than previously documented, with multiple chambers and passages extending deep into the limestone bluffs. Most significantly, her team's radar imaging suggested the presence of several large cavities at depths of over 100 feet, spaces too large to be natural formation, but too deep to have been excavated by the Whitmore family with 19th century tools. Dr. Reynolds hypothesized that these cavities might have been created by ancient peoples, possibly ancestors of the Cherokee or earlier inhabitants, and that Cornelius Whitmore might have somehow learned of their existence and believed them to be sites of sacred or mystical significance. Her team attempted to excavate down to these deeper chambers, but abandoned the effort after their drilling equipment struck an unexpectedly hard layer of rock approximately 30 feet below the surface, rock that their geological consultant identified as a type of basalt that should not exist in this limestone region. The drilling also released a small amount of water or liquid that, when sampled, showed chemical properties reminiscent of the samples collected by Dr. Marsh in 1892, though without the strange behavioral characteristics he had reported. Dr. Reynolds' team experienced none of the supernatural manifestations reported by earlier investigators, though several team members did note feeling uncomfortable at the site and being glad to conclude their work there. Today, the Whitmore property remains in the possession of Madison County, its legal status uncertain and its practical value nil. The land is not officially restricted, but no serious proposals for its development have been made, and it exists in a kind of administrative limbo, neither properly maintained nor actively monitored. The foundation stones from the demolished chapel are still visible if one knows where to look, scattered among the undergrowth and the encroaching forest. The location of the underground chamber is marked only by a depression in the earth where the iron grate has rusted away and the rubble fill has settled and partially collapsed. Local residents still avoid Crow's Basin, and the hollow maintains its reputation as a place where the natural order is somehow thin or compromised, where the boundaries between possible and impossible become dangerously permeable. Those who have visited the site in recent years, usually researchers or tourists drawn by the case's dark history, consistently report a sense of unease, a feeling of being watched by hostile intelligence, and a compulsion to leave the area that grows stronger the longer one remains. The ultimate fate of Cornelius Whitmore and his 3 daughters remains unknown. No bodies were ever recovered, no reliable sightings were ever confirmed, and no evidence of their survival in any other location has ever been discovered. The woman who appeared in Huntsville in 1909, claiming to be Constance Whitmore, may have been exactly who she claimed, or she may have been an impostor who had learned details of the case and constructed a story to exploit the mystery for unknown purposes. The truth of what occurred in that underground chamber on June 21st, 1892, died with those who were present, if indeed they died at all, or was transformed into something beyond the capacity of witnesses to communicate, if transformation, rather than death, was their fate. What remains are questions that more than a century of investigation has failed to answer. What was the nature of Cornelius Whitmore's research, and what did he believe he could accomplish through the rituals he conducted? Were the ancient texts he studied authentic documents of forgotten practices, or were they modern fabrications, or something in between? What exists in the deep chambers beneath Crow's Basin, and why do they exert such a powerful psychological effect on those who approach them? Most troubling of all, if something did emerge from that darkness in response to the Whitmore family's rituals, does it remain there still, waiting in patient malevolence for the next opportunity to interact with the world above? The Madison County Historical Society maintains a file on the Whitmore case, available to researchers by appointment, containing copies of the various investigation reports, witness testimonies, and scholarly articles that have accumulated over the decades. The file also contains photographs of the site taken at various periods, and those who examine these photographs often note something disturbing in the images from the chapel and the underground chamber. In many of these photographs, particularly those taken in low-light conditions or with flash illumination, there appear to be shapes or figures that were not visible to the photographers when the images were captured. These shapes resist precise interpretation, seeming to shift depending on the angle of viewing or the light conditions under which the photographs are examined. Skeptics dismiss these as artifacts of old photographic processes, tricks of shadow and light, or psychological projection by viewers seeking to see something mysterious. But those who have spent time examining the photographs, and particularly those who have visited Crow's Basin itself, often come away convinced that something is indeed present in those images, something that observes from the darkness at the edges of the frame, something that has been there since before the Whitmores arrived, and that will be there long after all memory of them has faded from human knowledge. The crows still gather in massive numbers around Crow's Basin, particularly during the dark of the moon and on the solstices and equinoxes. Their calls echo off the limestone bluffs in patterns that almost, but not quite, sound like language, like the chanting that witnesses reported hearing from the chapel in 1889 and 1892. The creek still flows through the hollow, and it still disappears underground into the cave system, and sometimes the water that emerges downstream carries a faint, oily sheen and an odor that cannot be quite placed, but that triggers instinctive revulsion in those who smell it. The forest grows thicker each year, reclaiming the clearing where the Whitmore house once stood, obscuring the scattered stones that mark where the chapel stood, gradually erasing all visible evidence that a family once lived there, and conducted practices that may have opened doors that should have remained forever sealed. But erasure from sight is not erasure from existence, and those who understand such matters know that certain places hold memory in the earth itself, that actions of sufficient intensity leave traces that persist long after the actors have departed, and that some secrets remain buried, not because they have been forgotten, but because the alternative to their burial is too terrible to contemplate. In the fall of 2003, a group of paranormal investigators from a cable television program obtained permission from Madison County to film an episode at the Whitmore site. The production crew spent 3 nights at Crow's Basin, using various electronic devices purported to detect supernatural presences and conducting seances in an attempt to contact the spirits of the Whitmore family. The episode was never broadcast. According to statements later given by crew members to local authorities, multiple equipment failures occurred during filming, with cameras malfunctioning, audio recorders picking up sounds that seemed to be voices speaking in unknown languages, and several crew members experiencing sudden illness or psychological episodes. The most disturbing incident involved the show's host, a man named Derek Chamberlain, who disappeared for approximately 40 minutes during the second night of filming. When he was found, he was standing at the edge of the depression that marked the former location of the underground chamber, staring down into the darkness with his arms outstretched. Other crew members stated that they had to physically restrain him from attempting to climb down into the opening, and that when they pulled him away, he fought against them with surprising strength while repeating phrases in what one crew member, who had studied Latin in college, identified as a corrupt form of that language mixed with words from no language he recognized. Chamberlain later claimed to have no memory of this episode and refused to return to the site. The production company ultimately chose to write off the expense of the shoot rather than attempt to salvage footage from the failed production. This incident led Madison County officials to finally take action to prevent future access to the site. In 2004, the county erected a chain-link fence around the immediate area of the former chapel and posted signs warning trespassers of unstable ground conditions and the danger of falling into sinkholes or cave openings. These measures have been only partially effective. The fence has been repeatedly cut or damaged by individuals seeking to reach the site, and county maintenance workers report that repairing the fence requires visits to a location they universally describe as deeply unpleasant. Several workers have refused to return to the site after initial visits, citing the oppressive atmosphere and their conviction that they were not alone in the hollow despite no visible presence of other people. The county has considered hiring a private security service to patrol the property, but has been unable to find any company willing to accept the contract after representatives visited the site to assess the assignment. Academic interest in the Whitmore case has continued sporadically. In 2015, a doctoral candidate in religious studies at Emory University, Sarah Chen, chose the Whitmore case as the subject of her dissertation titled Transgressive Ritual and Frontier Isolation, the Whitmore Family as a Case Study in Liminal Religious Practice. Chen spent considerable time reviewing archival materials and conducting interviews with descendants of the original investigators and witnesses. Her research uncovered several previously unknown documents, including letters written by Cornelius Whitmore to various occult booksellers in Chicago and Boston during the 1880s. These letters, preserved in the commercial archives of the bookselling firms, reveal that Cornelius was specifically seeking texts related to pre-Christian European mystery religions, Gnostic heresies, and what he referred to in one letter as the chthonic cults of the ancient Mediterranean. One particularly revealing letter, dated March 1887, and addressed to a bookseller named Solomon Wise in Boston, states explicitly that Cornelius believed he had discovered a location in the Arkansas hills where the substrate of reality was particularly weak, and where it might be possible to make contact with entities or forces that existed outside normal space and time. He wrote that indigenous peoples had long recognized such places and had developed prohibitions and taboos to prevent dangerous interactions, but that with proper knowledge and preparation, these locations could serve as gateways to extraordinary forms of consciousness and existence. Chen's dissertation, completed in 2017, argues that Cornelius Whitmore was not simply a deluded fanatic, but rather a scholar who had synthesized knowledge from multiple esoteric traditions, and who had identified genuine geological and possibly archaeological features at Crow's Basin that gave some objective basis to his theories. She suggests that the deep chambers detected by ground-penetrating radar in 1998 may indeed be artificial constructions of great age, possibly created by the ancestors of the woodland cultures that inhabited the Ozarks between 1000 BCE and 1000 CE. These cultures are known to have constructed ceremonial mounds and earthworks, and Chen proposes that they may also have created subterranean ritual chambers at locations they considered sacred or powerful. If Cornelius somehow learned of or discovered these ancient chambers, his attempts to use them for his own ritual purposes might have interfered with structures or systems whose original functions we cannot begin to understand. Chen stops short of endorsing supernatural explanations for the family's disappearance, but argues that the psychological and physiological effects reported by visitors to the site suggest some genuine environmental factor, possibly related to unusual electromagnetic properties or gas emissions from the deep limestone formations that interacts with human consciousness in ways that modern science has not yet adequately investigated. Chen attempted to visit Crow's Basin herself in 2016 as part of her research, but was unable to complete her investigation. In an interview published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in 2018, she stated that she spent approximately 2 hours at the site, taking photographs and making observational notes, before experiencing what she described as a sudden and overwhelming panic attack, despite having no history of anxiety disorders. She stated that the sensation was not merely fear, but a conviction, arriving fully formed in her consciousness that she was in immediate mortal danger and that she needed to leave the hollow immediately, or she would never leave at all. Chen, trained in academic skepticism and aware that she might be influenced by the site's reputation, attempted to remain and continue her work, but the compulsion to flee became so overpowering that she eventually abandoned her equipment and ran back to her vehicle. She drove directly to Fayetteville and checked into a hotel, where she spent the next several days in a state of extreme agitation, experiencing nightmares and intrusive thoughts about the underground chambers beneath the chapel. It was only after returning to Atlanta, a distance of over 700 miles from Crow's Basin, that these symptoms began to subside. Chen concluded her dissertation without having completed her planned on-site investigation, and in the interview, she stated that she has no intention of ever returning to Madison County, Arkansas. The most recent development in the ongoing story of the Whitmore site occurred in October 2023, when Madison County officials were contacted by the United States Geological Survey regarding unusual seismic readings detected in the Crows Basin area. A USGS seismologist, Dr. Patricia Kowalski, reported that monitoring stations established in the region to study minor earthquake activity in the Ozark Plateau had detected a series of low-frequency vibrations emanating from the area around the former Whitmore property. These vibrations occurred in regular patterns, approximately every 29 days, corresponding roughly to the lunar cycle. Dr. Kowalski stated that the frequency and amplitude of these vibrations did not match any known natural geological process, and that while they were far too subtle to be felt by humans without specialized equipment, their regularity suggested some ongoing process or activity beneath the surface. The USGS requested permission to install additional monitoring equipment at the site and to conduct exploratory drilling to investigate the source of the vibrations. Madison County initially granted this permission, but the project was quietly canceled in early 2024 after preliminary site visits by USGS personnel resulted in 3 separate incidents of equipment malfunction and 2 cases of personnel refusing to continue work at the location. Dr. Kowalski's official report, available through the USGS Public Records Database, attributes the cancellation to budget constraints and reprioritization of research objectives. But unofficial communications obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests suggest that the decision was driven by the inability to maintain a research presence at a site that personnel consistently described as hostile and dangerous, despite the absence of any identifiable threat. Today, more than 130 years after the Whitmore family disappeared, Crows Basin remains exactly what it has been since before the first European settlers arrived in the Arkansas Ozarks, a place apart, a location where the normal rules seem not to apply, where the boundary between the world we know and something else grows thin and permeable. The crows still gather there in numbers that defy ecological explanation. Thousands of birds covering the trees like black leaves, their collective voice a sound that carries for miles and that seems to form words in languages no living person speaks. The cave system still extends into darkness beneath the limestone bluffs, its passages unexplored, its depths unknown, its contents a matter of speculation and dread. The depression in the earth, where the Whitmore family chapel once stood, still emits that faint odor of corruption and something else, something that has no name in modern languages, but that triggers responses buried deep in the human brainstem. Responses inherited from ancestors who knew enough to avoid places where the earth felt wrong and where the darkness seemed too deep and too aware. Researchers and investigators continued to propose new theories to explain the Whitmore case, each attempting to fit the documented facts into a framework that preserves rational understanding and scientific materialism. Cornelius Whitmore was mentally ill, they suggest, and led his family into a murder-suicide, with the bodies hidden somewhere in the extensive cave system where they have simply never been found. Or the family staged their disappearance to escape scrutiny, fleeing to another state and establishing new identities, living out their lives in anonymity, while Madison County searched for bodies that were never there. Or the daughters, driven to desperation by years of abuse and captivity, murdered their father and disposed of his body before fleeing separately, each taking a different path to freedom and never revealing the truth of what they had done. These theories are neat, plausible, and entirely inadequate to encompass the full scope of the evidence. They do not explain the underground chamber and its carved walls. They do not explain the chemical properties of the dark liquid in the pool. They do not explain the consistent reports of psychological effects experienced by visitors to the site across more than a century. They do not explain the seismic readings, the electromagnetic anomalies, the photographic artifacts, the dreams and visions and compulsions that seem to emanate from Crow's Basin like a spiritual contagion. Most significantly, they do not explain why a place that should be merely an abandoned property in a remote Arkansas hollow continues to exert such a powerful effect on those who encounter it, why it draws researchers and curiosity seekers despite every warning, and why so many of those who visit it come away changed in ways they struggle to articulate but cannot deny. The archive of materials related to the Whitmore case grows slowly but steadily. Each decade adds new reports, new investigations, new testimonies from individuals who visited Crow's Basin seeking answers and found only deeper questions. The pattern is consistent: initial skepticism, methodical investigation, increasing unease, encounter with phenomena that resist explanation, and ultimately retreat and rationalization. Researchers arrive convinced they will be the ones to solve the mystery, to provide the definitive explanation that will domesticate the Whitmore case and render it comprehensible. They leave with their certainty shaken, their scientific frameworks inadequate, and their sleep troubled by dreams of darkness and voices calling from deep beneath the earth. Some never speak of their experiences again. Others become obsessed, returning repeatedly to the site or spending years analyzing data and seeking patterns that might reveal the truth. None have succeeded in providing an explanation that satisfies both the evidence and the demands of conventional reality. Perhaps the most honest assessment of the Whitmore case comes not from researchers or academics, but from the people who have lived for generations in Madison County, who have heard the stories passed down from grandparents and great-grandparents, who have felt the weight of Crow's Basin's presence, even if they have never visited the site. These residents, when pressed, will often say simply that there are places in the Ozarks where the world is different, where old things persist, where the past is not safely buried but remains active and aware. They will say that their ancestors, both native and European, knew to leave such places alone, to neither disturb them nor attempt to use them, to pass by quickly and speak of them rarely. They will say that Cornelius Whitmore's sin was not that he practiced forbidden rituals or studied dangerous knowledge, but that he failed to understand that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed, and that some exchanges, once initiated, cannot be terminated by human will alone. They will say that whatever bargain or summoning Cornelius attempted in that underground chamber on June 21st, 1892, may not yet be concluded, that the transaction begun that night continues still, waiting for completion or for new participants to take up where the Whitmore family left off. As for the three sisters, Adelaide, Beatrice, and Constance Whitmore, their fate remains the darkest mystery of all. Were they victims of their father's obsession, innocent women trapped by circumstance and familial duty into participating in practices they did not understand and could not escape? Or were they, by the end, willing participants, transformed by years of ritual and exposure into something other than the young women who had arrived in Arkansas in 1871? The testimonies are contradictory. Some witnesses describe them as clearly prisoners, others as devoted disciples. Some saw fear in their eyes, others saw something far more disturbing, a kind of anticipatory hunger, a desire for transformation regardless of cost. The woman who appeared in 1909, claiming to be Constance, said she had fled in terror, but her own physical impossibilities suggested she had been changed by her experiences in ways that transcended simple trauma. If she was truly Constance Whitmore, then whatever occurred in that underground chamber had effects that extended beyond death or disappearance into territory that medicine and biology cannot map. The chapel is gone now, demolished more than a century ago, its stones scattered and overgrown. The house where the family lived has collapsed into a mound of rotting timber, barely distinguishable from the forest floor. The garden where Cornelius worked has been reclaimed by native vegetation. Every year the forest grows denser, the paths grow more obscure, and the visible traces of human habitation grow fainter. In another century, perhaps sooner, there may be nothing left at the surface to indicate that a family once lived in Crow's Basin, nothing to mark the location of the chapel, nothing to warn the unwary away from the depression in the earth that leads down to chambers that should not exist. But the absence of surface markers will not mean the absence of what lies beneath. The cave system extends deeper than any investigation has penetrated. The carved chambers wait in perpetual darkness. The pool at the center of it all, emptied or dormant, but perhaps not destroyed, remains, as it has remained for how long, no one can say. And if the seismic readings are to be believed, something down there continues to pulse and breathe in rhythm with the moon, maintaining patterns established long before the Whitmores arrived and persisting long after their disappearance, patient and purposeful, waiting for time and chance to bring it new voices to answer its call, new blood to feed its ancient hunger, new souls to add to whatever collection it has been assembling through the centuries in the darkness beneath the Arkansas hills. This is the story of the Whitmore sisters and the secret buried beneath their family chapel insofar as any story can be told when so much remains unknown and unknowable. The documented facts are preserved in archives and official reports. The testimonies of witnesses and investigators provide fragments of a larger picture. But the truth, the complete and final truth of what happened to Cornelius, Adelaide, Beatrice, and Constance Whitmore remains where it has always been, in the darkness beneath Crow's Basin, in chambers carved by hands that were old when the first humans crossed into the Americas, in the depths where light fails and where something waits with patience that measures time not in years but in epochs, confident that what has been started will eventually be finished, that what has been opened will draw others to enter, and that the membrane between worlds once torn can never be completely repaired but only temporarily patched over by ignorance and time until the next curious seeker, the next ambitious scholar, the next desperate soul comes seeking forbidden knowledge and finds instead a darkness that has been waiting specifically for them, that knows their name though they have never spoken it in that place, and that welcomes them home to a destiny written in stone and blood and whispered promises long before they were born.